Well, good evening, everyone. We're so happy to have all of you here. And I think people are gradually beginning to enter the room, uh, to the webinar. Well, I'd like to welcome you to the February 2025 Global Read webinar. I'm Brenda Randolph, the Co-Outreach Director at the Center for African Studies at Howard University. This is our 8th Global Read webinar. We are so excited about that. And you can see the recordings of our previous webinars online at the Center for African Studies. And in a bit, I will drop the link in the chat so that you can get there. Also with us tonight from Howard University is Dr. Vanessa Oyugi, who is our other co-outreach director of the Center for African Studies. Anya Ueno, who is our media person, who is providing our technical assistance and making this Zoom run well tonight. And also Dr. Helen Bond of Howard School of Education, who will moderate the Q&A. Now, the Global Reads webinar is sponsored by the World Area Book Awards, which includes our award, which is the Children's Africana Book Award, or as we call it, CABA. Also, there's the Americas Award, which focuses on Latin America, the Freeman Book Award, which focuses on books set in East and Southeast Asia, the Middle East Book Award, and SABA, the South Asia Book Award. Each year, the World Area Book Awards sponsor 60-minute webinars that feature a presentation by an award-winning author with discussion on how to incorporate multicultural literature into the classroom. And you can see the list of upcoming webinars on the Teaching the World website, and I will also drop that link into the chat. Now, founded in 1991, CABA was the first of the Area Studies Book Awards. We have more than 154 books that have been recognized, and hundreds of authors and illustrators are members of our winner's circle. With us tonight is Lesley Younge, one of the 2024 CABA winners. Now, you can see video clips of Lesley and our event that we had at Howard University in October, and with the other 2024 winners on the CABA page, which is on the center's website. I'll drop that link in the chat. And now I'll turn the program over to Vanessa, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
Yes, thank you, Brenda. And it is my pleasure to introduce our 2024 CABA winner, Lesley Younge. She is an educator and writer from Silver Spring, Maryland. She currently teaches middle school English in Washington, D.C. at Mah-ray School. This is her 19th year in the classroom. Lesley debuted as an author in 2023 with 2 books for young people. The book she's discussing today is Nearer My Freedom, which was co-authored with her mentor, Monica Edinger. And it is an award-winning young adult verse novel remix of British abolitionist Olaudah Equiano's seminal autobiography. A. Train Allen, her first picture book, was an inaugural Own Voices, Own Stories Grand Prize winner, awarded by Sleeping Bear Press. Lesley is also a poet, and her work has appeared in Michigan Quarterly Review, Midnight and Indigo, Full Bleed, and others, including Poetry Magazine's newest issue, which features poems for young people. Lesley blogs and shares resources at teacherlesley.com. We are so happy to have you here today. Welcome, Lesley.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to present tonight as both an author, but also as an educator who has worked in multiple grades and multiple disciplines, and just really appreciates all the work that teachers do to bring books to young people, bring stories to young people, bring histories to young people. And so we hope that Near My Freedom might find a place in some of the classrooms that you find yourselves in. And tonight I'll be sharing a lot of ideas. I'll go ahead and share my screen. Okay. So tonight the theme is going to be multiple entry points, multiple pathways. When this is advertised for K through 12, that's a wide span, but I really do think Near My Freedom, our book, and also the story of Olaudah Equiano can find a place in that wide of a range. So just a little bit more about myself. I'm originally from California. I lived in New York for a long time. I do work at a school in DC. I have one son, and I am the author of 2 books, and soon will have 4 books out. I'm working on 2 projects that have to do with nonviolence. But I approach book writing and teaching just with sort of 2 hats, like just teacher and writer. And I really want to bring that tonight. So keep in mind that Olaudah Equiano lived a rich and spectacular life. And we really tried to capture that life in Nearer My Freedom using his own words, the words of his autobiography, which was published in 1789. So just keep in mind, how might his story resonate with your students? Nearer My Freedom was a book that has a story. It was a labor of love, and we've just been so incredibly honored that it has had the success that it has had, including winning the Children's Africana Book Award. And there was a beautiful ceremony in the fall for that. We've just been astounded at the reception of it on various book lists. It's received 5-starred reviews, and it was a YALSA Excellence in Nonfiction for Young Adults finalist. What I think is important about this list is it has been quite easy to get it into schools. With all of these sort of verified qualifications, we have found a lot of reception in both public and private schools. And so we are happy to work with any teachers who are going through approval processes. We understand that that is totally a thing, especially in these times. And we have found that there's been great reception, largely based on all of this awareness and advocacy on behalf of lots of organizations and publications. So that's what I think is important about all of this, especially for teachers. So Nor My Freedom has a story, and that story begins with my mentor and myself. Monica Edinger hired me for my first teaching job almost 20 years ago, and we became fast friends. We were teaching 4th grade at the time, and our social studies curriculum was centered on the transatlantic slave trade. And it was centered around immigration, and then there was a unit on the transatlantic slave trade. And what we really wanted to do was start the story in Africa. And Monica knew about the autobiography of Olaudah Equiano, and she knew about an adaptation that had been written by Anne Cameron. The Kidnapped Prince is a great adaptation, covers about half of his story, and it's written in prose at a grade level that I would say is 2nd through 3rd grade. And it's a wonderful book, and we used it with our students. We actually started making found poetry from the book, The Kidnapped Prince. And that allowed us to see that even younger students who are studying the transatlantic slave trade, when it was rooted in the narrative of someone who experienced it, could understand what was happening, could approach the topic with empathy, with curiosity, and could tackle the hard topic of slavery in the classroom with the support of a great text. Monica is a writer. She is a book reviewer, and she would absolutely be here tonight. But part of our story is that while writing Nearer My Freedom, Monica suffered a debilitating stroke, and so she is unable to present with me tonight. But she's always with me, and we just are so proud that we were able to do this project together. So when Monica was ready to write, she had written a wonderful book called Africa is My Home, about the story of the children on the Amistad. And she came to me and she said, you know, Lesley, the project that we used to do where we made found poetry about Olaudah Equiano, what if we did an entire book like that? What if we made the book for middle grade students? You know, there's the original autobiography that many students tackle in high school or college. There's the wonderful adaptation for younger students, but there's really nothing for the middle grades, for early and high school students that makes this text accessible to them. And looking at the projects that we had done with our 4th graders, we said we can do found poetry from the original text and create this verse novel remix for middle grade and high school students. And so that's what we did. We include this in the book, how we created the verse version, how we went through Olaudah Equiano's text. I mean, he's an incredible writer, and we absolutely wanted to preserve the story that he was telling. And so I say that we really just honed in on the gems in his writing and his prose, and then used that to create the poems that we included in the book. And so it's written in poetry, as you can see, with stanzas and line breaks, and thoughtfulness around sort of the way it appears on the page and also the way it reads out loud and sounds. And the method that we used is erasure poetry. The book also includes interspersed contextual essays explaining some of the things that he was talking about, the things that he was experiencing, the world that he was moving through. So there are interspersed contextual essays that help to give better background to some of the things that are going on in the poems and in his narrative. So that's just a little bit about the book structure. One of the first ways we think that this book can be used in the classroom is as a mentor text for finding verse in primary sources. And that's how we have seen some teachers approach it. Erasure poetry is also known as blackout poetry, right? It's a form of found poetry. You take an existing text and then it can be very physical, right? Erasing, blacking out, obscuring large portions of the text. And you can do a few things with that. You can create an entirely new text, and it's sort of like this collaboration between the original writer and the person who is finding the new poem in it. It can be a dialogue between the two, and it can also be what they say, a means of confrontation, right? Challenging or subverting the original meaning of a text. And I'll give an example of that shortly. What I love about this is the process supports so many skills that we're trying to get at in the classroom. First, we think it's a wonderful strategy for close reading, where students are needing to really focus in on what the author's saying, their purpose, what it means. They have to deeply understand the text, and it's a very motivating activity to get students to read closely, to reread, to read in between the lines, to infer, to do all of those wonderful reading skills that we want students to do. And so this is appropriate for both history classrooms and also English classrooms, or if they're combined in the humanities. These skills are essential in both of those sort of classrooms, and we think it fits in there. It's also very supportive for teaching annotation as students have conversations with the text, as they look for the things that they want to pull out. So if annotation is a skill you want your students to practice, it's very good for that. And then when they're selecting all of the words that they want to work with, there's some really fun ways to do some integrated with art, or to use different materials, or to allow students to just get really creative. There's some moments like that that are possible as well. And then if you're teaching the composition of poetry and there's literary devices, again, that was something that we paid attention to in the text. We think students will notice and can notice different poems having different forms, different line breaks, different sets of stanzas. They'll notice that we used various literary devices throughout, highlighted them. We do repetition, we do refrain. And so if you're looking at the composition of poetry, we think this can be a great mentor text as well. When I'm doing a demonstration of Near My Freedom and how to do found poetry, I love also sharing the work of Tracy K. Smith, who was one of our poet laureates in recent years. And she's a great example. While our book is pretty, the poems stay true to the story that Olaudah was telling, Tracy's a great contrast because she did a wonderful thing that is about a subversive meaning. And she actually took the Declaration of Independence and formed a poem called Declaration. And there's a really beautiful reading of it on the Poetry Foundation website, and I definitely recommend checking that out. So there are some really cool text pairings that can happen with Near My Freedom and other found verse poems. This is a style that is out there that is being used by some of the best poets in the world. And so I think highlighting it for students is a really wonderful idea. We've also found that it's very supportive for a wide range of learners if you have EMLs, if you have emergent language learners, if you have students with varying reading levels in your classroom, students who are still accessing wider vocabulary, doing found poetry is really supportive because the words are already on the page and they can spend time thinking about what they mean, looking up the definitions, and then making new arrangements from them. So again, this idea of a mentor text for found poetry, we've had some great stories from high school teachers who have wanted to do found verse as a project or assessment. One teacher was reading Washington Black, which is a really wonderful adult novel, a wonderful piece of literature, with a similar story, an adventurous young Black man who it's a wonderful story. And she had her students do found poetry in Washington Black and sort of demonstrate their understanding of the story there. But she used Near My Freedom as a mentor text. And then another colleague has shown it as the mentor text, but then he went on to have his students look at Supreme Court cases, both the majority opinion and the dissent, and they made found poetry from there. But he always highlights Near My Freedom as an example that doing found poetry is real, which I think is really cool. If you have any questions about anything, definitely I'm excited to talk more about this. So definitely let me know what you think about the idea of using Near My Freedom as a found verse mentor text. So that's sort of a craft piece. That's a craft piece. Now I want to get into some frameworks for talking about Olaudah Equiano in the classroom. And so the first one I'll do is talking about Olaudah Equiano, the African. He really led with that in his narrative. The entire narrative that he wrote, the goal was to provide a story that abolitionists could use to convince the British Parliament, who were debating this at the time, to start to dismantle this system, right, that they had embarked on. And so he begins his narrative in Africa with his home, with his childhood, with the people that he grew up with. And I think that that's really powerful. That was one of the reasons we began using the story with our fourth graders, was we wanted to not start the story of slavery with captivity, et cetera. We wanted to start with the richness of West African cultures, of West African civilizations, communities. And so Olaudah Equiano really provides a beautiful description of his home. The book begins, I was born in that part of Guinea, Africa, that extends along the coast from Senegal to Angola, where the trade for slaves is carried on. I was born in the kingdom of Benin, the most considerable as to wealth, richness, warlike inhabitants, and the power of its king. I was born in the year 1745 in a charming, fruitful vale called Asaka, in a province called Ibo, remote and fertile. I was born and named Olaudah, signifying fortune and one favored, having a loud voice and well spoken. I was born never hearing of white men, Europeans, nor of the sea. And then he goes on to describe his culture, the dancing, the singing, the poetry, the food, the buildings, the architecture, the family structures. And what comes across is this really rich culture and community that he was a part of and that he was removed from forcibly. And that had a really big impact on the abolitionists of that time. And so this is one of the possibilities for sharing Near My Freedom, is to have the intent to share his authentic recollections of his life, where he was born prior to captivity. There are often in curricula moments where students are studying kingdoms of Africa, where they're looking at the artwork, where they're looking at the Benin bronzes, right? And there are really wonderful art integration projects, as you can see, that are super appropriate for young children, where reading the beginning of the book, reading his description of his culture, and then diving into some of that hands-on work, thinking about the cultural aspects that he's talking about would be a really powerful experience. So that's definitely one suggestion that we have. Another suggestion is presenting Olaudah Equiano as Black Genius. I just recently did this presentation for some students, and this was really fun in celebration of Black History Month, which shout out Black History Month, wrapping up tomorrow. And I began with this quote that I just thought really encompassed Olaudah Equiano's story as well, from Nina Simone's Young, Gifted, and Black. You are young, gifted, and Black. We must begin to tell our young, there's a world waiting for you. Yours is the quest that's just begun. And I think that summarizes Olaudah Equiano's story beautifully, or at least launches it, right? He was extremely skilled. He was well-traveled, first by force, then by choice. Some aspects of his story that students find interesting are that he was enslaved by a British Navy officer. So he immediately began training as a sailor, and then later as a merchant, and then later as a hairdresser. He was always really looking for these opportunities to become more skilled, and to remain gainfully employed. He was employed as a free person by Dr. Charles Irving, who was a person of some note in England. He was a well-known scientist at the time. And he really was a self-made man. He was an abolitionist, a writer, a speaker, a husband. Diving into the travels of Olaudah Equiano can be really powerful. He went all over the world. He traveled across the Atlantic many times, all throughout the Caribbean, all throughout the Mediterranean, and even went to the Arctic on a scientific expedition. So geography is one way to integrate. We do have an educator guide that's available, and you can find that on my website. But one of the activities we have is finding, and as you're doing a read aloud, perhaps with some younger students, finding and marking the countries and regions Olaudah Equiano mentions in his narrative, and tracking all of the many travels that he did and all the parts of the world he saw in the 1700s, right? It's pretty amazing. He was, again, an explorer and a scientist. He traveled on a really well-known scientific expedition. Constantine Phillips went to look for the open polar sea. It resulted in several significant scientific discoveries. They didn't reach the North Pole, but they got pretty close. Both boats got stuck in the ice, so there's a really interesting naval story there. And they brought back some of the first descriptions of polar bears, gulls, and sea butterflies. Olaudah talks about seeing uh, all sorts of creatures and walruses. He talks about seeing all sorts of creatures for the first time and what it was like to be in such cold conditions. And he was on that ship because he was helping Dr. Charles Irving, who had a desalination machine, and they were drawing salt water from the sea and turning it into drinking water and doing experiments with that. So, he was an explorer and he was a scientist, and these major world events can be looked at from his perspective. So that's a possibility as well. He was an entrepreneur. So he freed himself, right? He has this great moment in his narrative that we tried to bring out where he talks about how he started with just a little sort of half bit, and he buys a tumbler on a Dutch island, and then he sells it for more money, and he's able to continue turning over these items and these goods until after he's traded for a little while, he has enough money. And, spoiler alert, eventually he's able to earn enough money to buy his own freedom. So Olaudah the Self-Emancipator is also a really powerful part of his genius story. And actually, the title of the book comes from a moment when he says, "Every day now brought me nearer my freedom. I was impatient to purchase it," right? And we made the cover found poetry as well, coming from those lines of the poem. So Olaudah Equiano, the Self-Emancipator, is another part of his Black genius. And then I always love to tell students that he became the first best-selling Black author in the world. He published his book in 1789. There were 9 editions between 1789 and 1794. Thousands of copies were sold. He had royalty as part of his subscription service. There were pirated versions in other countries. And at one point, he was the wealthiest Black man in the English-speaking world. And his daughter, he was able to leave her a large inheritance. And that was, not something everyone any race could do at the time. And certainly for somebody who had started off with his life, it was not expected. And so it just really points to him being a genius, and that being a story that can be very inspiring to students. And at the end of the day, just really encouraging them to tell their story, and to speak their truth, because that is what he did. And it really paid off for him, but it also helped other people. All right. Another framework for teaching Olaudah Equiano and Near My Freedom is as a freedom fighter. We've had, he sits on a long line and a long line of people who fought for freedom all around the world, fought for the freedom of enslaved Africans, fought for freedom on different shores, but it pairs well with books like The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass or Letter from a Birmingham Jail, or any of the protest literature that we have, the long tradition of protest literature. And this can be a really wonderful way to globalize that piece of the conversation, where typically we may just focus in on American voices. Olaudah Equiano becomes a more global voice to pair with these texts that are often in our schools already. I do think it's important to globalize the conversation about slavery, especially in American classrooms, to really bring to light just all of the ways in which the world was touched by the slave trade, all of the ways it built the economy of the global community, and to never sort of lose sight of that. And I think Olaudah really also brings that to light in his book. It can lead to some lines of inquiry about when slavery was abolished, because it's at different points in time in the world. We have some very, very late points in time when slavery is abolished. We have some very early times, but it varies. And for students to really know that this happened in different places, abolition happened in different places in different ways at different times. With the British abolition of the slave trade, it is before the United States. We have the Slave Trade Act, ending the slave trade in 1807. We have the Slavery Abolition Act happening in 1833. It takes effect in 1834. And so for students to know that, 30 years before we have the Civil War, and the 13th Amendment, that Britain had abolished the slave trade within the colonies, and that there is a legacy of abolition to look at across the shores. This photo is actually from during the George Floyd protests in Bristol. Protesters knocked over a statue of someone who was an enslaver in England, and they threw his statue into the river. So being able to sort of tie these different movements together, show their different timelines, that's a really wonderful project for the secondary classroom. Olaudah Equiano worked in partnership with people that often come up in European studies and studies of British history and studies of global history. So it's a great opportunity to talk about how he worked with individuals like Thomas Clarkson and Granville Sharp. He actually mentions Granville Sharp, the lawyer who helped to try many important cases that ended the slave trade in England. He talks about him in the book, knowing him, reaching out to him. Charles Ignatius Sancho, Olaudah Equiano, those are all other people who were working at the same time, and are people that we can bring into the narrative. Again, with this idea that globalizing the conversation helps to show its impact, and it's really important that we never lose sight of that. I think that's really important. And then to point out that as a freedom fighter, Equiano contributed by writing and speaking, right? This piece comes towards the end of the book, when he is appealing to Parliament to start to think about ways that they can dismantle this system. And he says in his narrative, I hope the slave trade will be abolished. He does not live to see that happen, but certainly his text, his writing, his speaking, he went on several book tours, contributed to the conversation, contributed to the convincing arguments that then allowed Parliament to start to pass laws that would dismantle the system. There are also some connections, on this freedom fighter thread, connecting to modern slavery, connecting to human trafficking. If that is a social justice topic that is coming up in your studies, again, he can be an entry point into that. It's ongoing. The Anti-Slavery Society that he was a part of still exists, and they are still taking action on this issue because, unfortunately, it has not completely ended. Another movement that you might tie him to is worker solidarity. When he's talking about ending the slave trade, and he's talking about the work, and he's talking about the value of the work that enslaved people do and how they contribute. I think there are threads of that that go all through out the worker movements of the past, and then also the worker movements of today. So if there's sort of an economic thread around workers and workers' rights, worker coalitions, worker protests, that is also a thread, I think, in the freedom fighter movement. Okay, so say you teach speech writing or rhetoric. Olaudah Equiano is an awesome model for that as well. The beginning of his book starts off, "To the Parliament of Great Britain, my lords and gentlemen, permit me to lay at your feet the following genuine narrative. To excite a sense of compassion for my unfortunate countrymen. When the question of abolition is to be discussed, thousands are to look for happiness or misery in consequence of your determination." He is writing this book to appeal to people who are powerful and can do something about the slave trade and about slavery in Britain. And so the entire book is really an argumentative piece. And so if you teach the rhetorical triangle, if you dive into logos, pathos, and ethos, one of the activities that we've provided in the teacher's guide is using Near My Freedom and looking for rhetorical devices throughout the book and having students find examples of those rhetorical devices that we often teach in the secondary classroom, finding those examples and using Near My Freedom in that way, because he really uses the wide range. He really uses the wide range. And we think that that can be a really rich way to connect to the text as well. Again, he sits in a long line of people who found their voice, and I know that we so much want to encourage our young people to find their voices. And so this can just be a really great way to draw connections from the past to the present. Who are the young people that are speaking out today? And how can our young people find their voice as well? So, Olaudah Equiano lived a rich and spectacular life. How might his story resonate with your students? Tonight, I presented a variety of opportunities, including the craft of found verse, and then several different frameworks. His experience growing up in a beautiful African community in West Africa in the Kingdom of Benin, his genius, his rhetoric, his masterful writing and speaking career that he had, and then his place in the long line of freedom fighters that throughout history have tried to impress upon us the importance of human rights. And Olaudah Equiano didn't always get it right. He struggled at times because once he became free, he sort of thought he had it. But he didn't necessarily as a merchant, as a sailor, completely divest himself from the slave trade. He really had to go through some difficult times grappling with his conscience to figure that out. And so I think that struggle is something we tried to really put into the book. But ultimately, he realizes that none of us are free until we are all free. And that is a message that we really hope students and teachers can work through together, because there is always still work to do. And we hope that his story, it was deeply inspiring to me and to Monica, and it was deeply inspiring to many of our cohorts of our students. And so we hope Near My Freedom helps to bring his story to more classrooms. It is sort of a for teachers by teachers kind of book. And we want to keep connecting around it. And so a lot of these ideas have come from people who've been implementing it in the classroom. And we've just been so honored by every single teacher that has chosen to do so. They teach it in the 5th grade at Mah-ray, and I get to go to classes next week and talk to those kids. So I'm really excited. So we just hope it resonated. Some of these ideas may have resonated tonight, may have sparked some more ideas, and we're excited to get into the Q&A and hear some of your questions. I'll just put this on the board. I'll try to get the educator guide. There's a link to it on the front page of my website, teacherlesley.com. It's free to download. Please check it out. Definitely stay in touch. And then, yeah, really open to all of your questions tonight.
Thank you, Brenda and Vanessa. I guess I'll just go ahead and get started. Thank you, Lesley, so much for this wonderful book. If someone could just drop the educator guide, the link to that in the chat right now, I think that would be helpful. And if there are questions, please feel free to just unmute and speak or drop your question in the chat. We really do want this to be a live conversation. There's the link. Wonderful.
Thank
I
you.
just thought this book was just the story of Equiano's life and experiences was just phenomenal, and I had just really enjoyed going through it and reading it. Before we start with any questions about tradecraft and how teachers can be supported by this, and you did such a wonderful job at explaining that, but we do have some questions. I want to do a call out. I have a few students online to please feel free to ask questions as well. And until we get a few questions either in chat or feel free to unmute and speak, I have a few myself to get us started. Okay. I noticed that, and I really did enjoy on page 9 how you included about the notes on language. That in this text that you included language such as enslaved person and enslaver rather than the terms that Equiano used at the time, like Negro and slave. So I guess this is a little bit about tradecraft. When teachers go to select books and there's no notes on language and the book is actually using some of the terms of the time and that they may feel uncomfortable with, that's not used today, how should they approach that? How should they approach that text?
Yes, yeah. Well, I actually teach To Kill a Mockingbird, so I deal with this all of the time. And we teach
It's a
Brown
great book
Homecoming
too.
too. Yeah, but we actually explicitly start with sort of explaining the evolution of language. We that there are words that Black people have used to name themselves. There are words that people outside of the Black community have used to name Black people. We talk about using colored or Negro versus African American or Black today. And we actually have this useful framework where we talk about red light words, yellow light words, and green light words. And so in To Kill a Mockingbird, the red light word is said 93 times, and that is a word no one will speak out loud in class. It will not be played in an audiobook. Well, when we don't watch the movie because it uses the red light word. I never say it, the students never say it. We have a protocol where we just pause and let there sort of be a pause, and then we move on, sort of acknowledging it, that it's there in the text, reflecting on that, and then moving on, but we don't ever say it out loud. We call colored and Negro yellow light words, where it is okay to quote them from the text. If the text is using those, that I tell them a story about my grandfather writing his autobiography, and he grew up calling himself a Negro and the Negro hospital. And I went to the Negro, I was the first Negro, he was a doctor. He's like, I was the first Negro doctor to get these privileges or that. And so we call those yellow light words, where if we're making a reference to someone who used those words within an older text, but we say that they're old. And so if we're thinking in our own, sort of from our own perspective, or describing somebody today, those are not words that we would use. We would use the green light words, which as of this moment are usually African American or Black American, but that it's really important to sort of clarify the context. So we try to introduce the nuance. We try to give them some guidelines for safety, and then sort of navigate it depending on the text that we're using.
Thank you so much for that, Lesley. We do have a question come in from Brenda Randolph, our wonderful organizer of these. Has your book escaped efforts to silence Black voices, especially about the slave trade?
So it's so interesting in all of this talk about banned books, and I don't feel like we shied away. We use the words white supremacy, we use the words colonization, but we have not been made aware of any challenges.
That's wonderful. That is wonderful. Any other questions? I have a couple more that I'm just dying to get out, but I want to also reach out to our audience to feel free to unmute, speak, become live, and ask questions. You said something about naming. There are a couple things I found so interesting that I didn't know about Equiano. On this, and I'm so glad that you put this history in. This was just wonderful. On the slave ship over, they renamed him Michael, and he resisted, and he said he wanted to be called Jacob, and he was cuffed. A hit, I presume, the way he wrote that, or the way it was written. And then later on, I guess his owner, or Pascal, named him Gustavus Vasa after the 16th century
The Swedish king.
Swedish king, yes.
Swedish king. A random Swedish king.
So have you made any, I mean, when I was reading that, I immediately thought about the renaming of indigenous children in boarding schools. The first thing, that would happen is that they would, their native name would be removed and it would be anglicized. Do you make any of those kinds of connections, or can you make those connections? Because as you said, his story is very broad.
You absolutely can, and talking about the importance of naming, and why he may have chosen. So for most of his life, and even when he got married and had a family, he went by Gustavus Vasa. It was when he wrote his autobiography that he really reclaimed his name, Olaudah Equiano. And thinking about that moment of writing your memoir, of writing your life, and that being the moment where you reclaim your name, and how powerful a moment that must have been, a decision that must have been, to decide to start to reclaim that history, that identity. So I definitely think that conversation about naming can support conversations about where people have been misnamed, renamed, or reclaimed their name. I think that's definitely something that could be done.
Wonderful. We do have some questions coming in. And some comments. I'll just read some of those. I love the idea of making more complex text accessible by using the found poetry format, creative spacing, structure that breathes. That would be a great project for secondary students. So thank you, Sarah. Angela Smith, very motivational information presentation. Thank you. Could you also speak to teaching truth in text during these difficult times? For example, the difference between fiction, nonfiction, biographies, and autobiographies, especially in the form of found poetry.
Mm. Yes, I mean that's one of the things that I think people have said they appreciate is this book is written in poetry, but it is Equiano's own words and it is him telling his own story. And so presenting this as a nonfiction text. There are just increasingly many beautiful books that are written about this time period, these histories. But we really have a wonderfully rich resource in those original narratives written by people who experienced themselves. And so again, that was our goal, was to allow younger students in middle grades, in high school, to access this story. And the original is wonderful, but it can feel dense, and depending on the reading levels of your students, it might not be accessible. And so our hope is that the original words, the original story, the original perspective does shine through, even through the found poetry, and that it makes it more appealing for them to read these true story, first person narratives about what it was like to go through the experience and come out on the other side. So yes,
Thank you,
for
Lesley.
that
We do have a
question.
hand here. Chambi, feel free to just turn your video on and share your question.
Thank you. First of all, congratulations for the book. I actually bought it during the event for my nephew and nieces, and they were very happy about it. The design is very dazzling.
Yeah. Oh, good.
So my question is really like a clarifying question, because it's a long time since I truly engaged with reading Equiano's work. But I remember there was this pushback or debate about whether it was really him or it was some white folks who kind of invented the narrative. So in the process of researching and writing this book, will you go as far as saying that claim is buried? Now we have a solid proof. This is it. This is him.
So we actually were able to have access to one of the people that's done a lot of research on Equiano's life, a man named Vincent Coretta, who's a professor at the University of Maryland and lives here locally. And he was one of the first people that presented the idea that Equiano may not have been born in Africa at all, that he may have been born in South Carolina. And we include a note that that debate has occurred, and that even Coretta does not land firmly anywhere in particular. It's like there are these documents that say this, there is this other evidence that says this. Overall, so much of Equiano's story can be verified by looking at other types of documents and cross-referencing. There's so much of the book that can be verified, and then there is this part where there were some questions, and I think they've landed on allowing that to be a question. I think where I go with it is, this value, this overvalue sometimes of certain kinds of records written by certain kinds of people. And I think we as Black people have to be careful about overinvesting in some of those systems that were never invested in our liberation. And so it's like if a baptismal record says this, that's within the system of these churches that were not our churches, that were not run by us. And there could have been a lot of different things at play. And so my instinct is to trust the man, to tell his story. And if more evidence comes to light, but my understanding is there are some things that raise questions. I think in the body of abolitionist literature, it was absolutely being written for a particular purpose, to convince white people to end slavery, right? Like that's the purpose of so many of these texts. And with that comes the kind of subtext that you're talking about, because that was the audience. But I think I choose to lean into, the opportunity he had to tell his truth. Some of the pieces there's a lot more about his sort of Christian conversion in the book than we actually put in. That might be the thread that we left out the most. We did put some of it in, but he goes on and on about his Christian conversion. And, at the time, that was really important to white abolitionists to show that Black people could be converted to Christianity and could be good Christians. So I think that's where I see sort of some of those influences, right? But at the end of the day, I think my instinct there is to trust the man. But we did put in a note about the controversy. And I think just presenting students with the controversy is interesting, right? And asking them to say, what will the record show about any of our lives? And it's like the Hamilton song, right? Like who lives, who dies, who tells your story? And I think there are some interesting ways that students can think about that. But thank you for that question.
And thank you. That was a very comprehensive answer. Thanks.
Yeah, okay. I'm a teacher. I'm going to try to answer comprehensively.
Yeah, that was a good question, because I'd also read that there was a few people that raised the claim that he was born in the West Indies. And I think trying to maybe delegitimize his narrative, I'm not sure. But yeah, thought that was interesting, questioning his birthright to Africa.
Yes.
So,
And then
yeah.
I always say, like, ask who's invested in that too, right? Like who's
Right.
invested in discrediting him.
We've got a great question in the chat from Elsa. Thank you so much. Your book is tremendous. Do you encourage students to read aloud in order to feel the text rhythm and cadence and the power of words? I also hope for you to talk more about your process of developing the contextual boxes.
Yeah, absolutely. So definitely reading aloud. And I'm an advocate for reading aloud at all stages of literacy development, even in the secondary classroom. I actually use audiobooks with my 7th graders. Audiobooks these days are so well produced. And we have a wonderful audiobook. I should have showed a slide of it. But we actually cast 2 fabulous actors. Clifford Smith is a British Nigerian actor, and Henriette Zumutu is an American actress. Clifford reads the poetry, and then Henriette reads the contextual essays. And so there's sort of this dual voice situation going on. So definitely recommend reading aloud, definitely recommend using the audiobook to enhance the feeling of the poetry. And then in terms of the contextual boxes, yeah, so I think that's a unique feature of the book that people aren't always expecting, and something that people and teachers really appreciate. So personally, I love context. Doing background on the books that I teach in my English classroom is probably my favorite part, because I think it brings so much more to the reading experience. And I think kids feel like when they get lost, they check out, they're done. If they can't understand something or don't know about something, it's really a way that the literature can slip away from them. So while we knew we wanted to put the contextual essays in from the very beginning. And what we were looking for were moments where we got confused, where we said, I don't know much about that. He was talking, he has a large section that he spends in the 7 Years' War, right? I was like, I remember learning about that as, this kind of war, but let me go back and do some research. So anytime I really wanted to dive in and do more research, that was when we thought we might have a good topic for the contextual essays. So we were looking for those places where students' understanding might slip, and then we wanted to be there to catch them and fill it in. And again, this is a for teachers by teachers book. We wanted to just really support educators who might want to use this text and make sure they had everything they needed to be successful.
Thank you. I really appreciate what you said in terms of teaching the controversy. I've noticed among my pre-service teachers during this time, there's a little bit of shying away on sort of controversial things. They're not sure of their footing in this so-called new space. And that notion of just stepping into that and including some of the controversy in here makes the book very, very strong. Any tips that you might offer on selecting a mentor text?
Selecting a mentor text overall, just in general?
Just in general.
Yes. So we're always looking for excellence. We're always looking for resonance. And I think it starts with us, sort of having some ideas of what we want our students to experience and to feel, and then looking for the texts that make us feel that, right? It's so interesting because I think about the books that I teach, and we're sort of going through this process where we're coming up with rationales for like, why do I teach this book, right? Why do I love this book so much? Why do I come back to this book year after year? Is it still doing what I want it to do? And I just finished teaching a book I love. It's called Butterfly Yellow by Tang Ha Lai, and sort of a slow burn of a book. Kids are like, why are we reading this? It's set in 1981. There's a Texas, there's a cowboy. But then we get into the symbolism, right? And I cannot find a book where there are multiple symbols embedded so beautifully and that students can grasp and see and talk about and analyze. It's just a really gorgeous, gorgeous, Tang Halai is just really talented at doing that. And I think of that as a specialty of hers. And so, just sort of having in my head what it is I want to teach, looking for the text that lifts that up really beautifully. And then, it's usually going to be a text I've fallen in love with first.
Very good. Brenda just said, as we wrap up, she wanted to share a few pages from the CAVA website. We have one more quick question. I think, Brenda, maybe one more. Would you please put the book you just mentioned in the chat?
Oh, yes, I will do that.
Let's see. Do you
Because I
have
love
any?
it. I think a lot of
Yeah,
people should read it.
it's wonderful. Do you have any suggestions for how to introduce your book to freshman composition students who are accustomed to reading literal text, textbooks, novels?
Yes, yes. So I think that could be freshman composition students who are accustomed to reading literal texts. I think the craft angle could be really rich, sort of showing them how the prose became the poetry, and engaging them in form, a conversation about form, having them even, because these are freshmen, maybe compare the forms, compare the prose version to the verse version, thinking about word selection, thinking about organization, what choices was Equiano making, and what choices did we make? I think that could be a great way in. And then probably allowing them to enjoy the story for a little bit, but then looking for some ways to engage them and talking about the moments where excellent writing is going on.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the Q&A. Thank you, audience. I'm going to hand it over to Brenda Randolph. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, Lesley. And if I can, I'm going to try to share my screen here. Can you see the screen?
Yes, you can.
Okay. First, I wanted to go to our CAVA page. Here's a list. I mentioned that we had 150 winners. So you can come, this is on Howard University's, the Center for African Studies website. You can see our all times winners list. And here's the page that has the video highlights of the 2024 ceremony that we had at Howard University, and some photos from the luncheon, and you can see all of the winners. Then I wanted to, before that, we have one more day left of our Read Africa 2025 opportunity. And my nonprofit, Africa Access, and the Center for African Studies are inviting educators, librarians in Washington, Maryland, and Virginia to suburbs to sign up to receive a free book. And you can see one of the free books that you can request is Nearer My Freedom. And I think we've we've said, Washington, Maryland, Virginia, we will open it up to anybody who's here tonight. So you got one more day to request a book. And we just ask you, if you can, to just share the book with your students and then tell us how that went through a reader's response. Then the nonprofit that I have, which is Africa Access, we do reviews of children and young adult books on Africa. So if you come here and you click on Near My Freedom, you will see the review, the wonderful review that was written about the book. And I think, I'm sorry, that's the wrong place, book-related lessons. I believe we put a link, we did, to the teaching guide, if that's still working. Yeah. Is that it, Lesley, or?
Yes, that's it. And then if they scroll down a little bit, there's the link to download.
Link to download. Okay,
Yes.
great. Yeah. And I'm going to stop sharing. Again, thank you so much, Lesley, and we invite all of you to stay engaged with us at the Center for African Studies. Have a
Thank you.
good evening.
Thank you so much for having me. This was so much fun. I really appreciate everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.